in a first of its kind, a dictionary of French and IsiZulu has been published. It seeks to grant access to South Africa's most spoken language to the Francophone immigrants for social integration. So let's find out more about this French-IsiZulu Manual of Conversations with the co-author of this document, that's Mongezi Bolofo, who joins us via our video link this morning. Mongezi, sawubona, or should I say bonjour? Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Lovely to have you on the program. Quite an interesting dictionary, this, for lack of a better term, that you've been able to put together. And I suppose the first question becomes, what really is the relationship between IsiZulu and French? Or is that a bit of a weird question to ask? Because, of course, all languages are related in some way or the other.
Of course. Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to the viewers at home. Quite a very interesting question because IsiZulu has seemingly been a big language in the Southern Africa, but it has never explored itself through to the Francophone world. So where they meet is in South Africa, where there are a lot of immigrants coming from the Francophone world trying to socially integrate in South Africa and having a problem of trying to learn IsiZulu, the widely spoken language, in a third language, which is English, a language they themselves don't understand. So this is where French meets IsiZulu, and they try to have this good matrimony, which has come to the fruition of such works like this Lexicon of French-IsiZulu.
That's such an interesting point that you make. I mean, typically, anybody who tries to learn a new language will try translate into English first and then into that language. And we know how often, not to use this cliche, but things get lost in translation. How much of a challenge has that been for you?
Of course, it is a great challenge. For me, who is a Mosotho who grew up also in KZN, so I've always been bilingual, but I cannot imagine in someone else's linguistic abilities of trying to learn another language through a third language or a second language. So it is very it's like a conundrum that needs one to sort out, and you know that you will never reach the levels of perfection of understanding that language, and the nuances of that language would remain vague to you, and so you will never reach a level of fluency and perfection that is expected.
Yeah. I mean, ironically, as you were speaking, you and I are speaking about IsiZulu and French in English, which I guess gives credence to what I was pointing out initially. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has written so much about the power of language, has also had very interesting insights about ways through which we nurture mostly indigenous languages. Some of the points he makes in his writings is how important it is for us to continue nurturing indigenous languages, lest they're left behind, because typically when you are able, for instance, to converse in a certain language, you allow it to grow and it becomes a vessel of knowledge in some instances that is able to house certain ideas that indigenous languages sometimes don't. I mean, as you were putting together this kind of work, how important was it for you to ensure that even just some of the values and principles that are contained in the languages are expressed in these translations?
It was of crucial importance, Ayanda, to look at the worldview between the two languages. One of the interesting things that I found while I was working with Dr. Michel Lafaux on this project was that the English at some point would lack a particular term or an equivalent of a word, which French would have. Straight from Zulu to French, they see the same concept in the same way. So there is a translatability of the worldview in the two languages. It's just that they've never met. So the role of English as a big brother of the indigenous languages has already done what Ngugi is talking about, that it hampers the growth of the language. So if we need the indigenous languages to grow, they need to universalize. Which a project like this, we need to see a relationship of Zulu to Swahili. We need to see a relationship of Zulu to French. We need to see accessibility of Zulu even to the Italian speakers and the Dutch speakers. They need to be able to say, we want to dive into Zulu. And if the Zulus want to dive into other languages also and internationalize themselves and universalize themselves, they should be able to do that without English being a big brother that facilitates that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in many instances, indigenous languages are not only tools to communicate, they're also, vehicles of carrying culture from one generation to the other. In fact, there are many idioms and phrases in isiZulu which say a lot more about the language as they do also about the tradition and culture of the Zulu people, for argument's sake. How did that complicate the work that you need to do, the transferal of cultural and language codes as you do these translations?
Of course, these languages come from two different parts of the world. And of utmost crucial was that we should be able to see if there are those things, and then we take them out and use them as a material for more research, which kind of brings the two social fabric of these two languages together, and we see how we then facilitate those things. So it was very much important to think about the translatability of that. I mean, the first bilingual dictionary that Zulu has was in 1861 by Bishop John Colenso, and that was forming the relationship between isiZulu and English and looking at the translatability of such things as culture, traditions. Just last year there was a sort of sounds that were made around the passing of the King of AmaZulu, King Goodwill Zwelithini, when we were talking about planting the king, interning the king, instead of burying and instead of saying the king has died, So vocabulary like that always causes a problem when it comes to work like this, where we should find terms and ways and see if those things are understood the very same way in that culture. Are they symbolic? Are they important? And are we not being culturally insensitive when we offer equivalents of these languages?
Yeah. Typically for those of us who aren't necessarily working with this kind of content as closely as you are, we're fascinated by how things sound when we try to find connections between different languages. For instance, people will speak about itafula and tafel, which is isiZulu and Afrikaans, sounding very similar. I guess, telling us that perhaps there have been some kind of overlaps in history in one way or the other. I'm putting you on the spot here, but do we have any of that kind of relationship between isiZulu and French? And I'm asking this, keeping in mind that they sound very different, these two languages.
A very fascinating discovery was certain words that we use in isiZulu, which are not quite overtly visible in English. From the top of my head, I can think of the papamos. What you call it, a grapefruit. In French, they call it papamos, and in Zulu, it's ipapamuzi. So there was a relationship of translatability between the two languages. Wow. That we were able to extract from either French or Dutch, and be able to take that word, and that word sounds exactly the same. So there were words like those which we discovered here that they have a phonosymbolic system that kind of makes them relatable, and the meanings sometimes are even shared at the same time.
It's fascinating stuff. What does that tell us? I mean, is there anything we could lean into that? Is it just a coincidence that this is the case? I mean, what are you able to draw from those kind of similarities?
It's the power. It's the power of language. It's the power of languages, as I said, that certain worldviews are documented in this lexicographic work. But there's so much more to learn from each other, that we see that history tells us that human beings, at some point, they were all of one species, one race, and were the cradle of the humankind. And when we talk about things like language, this is where you start to see all those nuances coming at play, and the relationship between the languages, even though they are far from each other in terms of the geographical landscape, but you find various things that are so common in the language. I mean, you can think of one language is like the languages spoken in Japan, which has a lot of onomatopoeic sound and idiophonic sounds that are similar to how the Zulus would relate and other Ngunis would relate their sound systems when they're talking about onomatopoeic and idiophonic words in that language. How sound is used into naming things, So that tells us that, at the end of the day, we all are one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a great way to remind ourselves of our shared humanity. All right, so this dictionary, how would one need to approach it? I mean, we all typically know how, translations or documents that translate texts typically work. Usually, well, as an aside, I mean, I remember trying to write an Afrikaans speech when I was still in primary school, and how oftentimes it's so easy to get things wrong when you're translating word for word. Because language simply doesn't work that way, I would want, for instance, to find a translation of a fly, and I'd realize later on that I'm actually translating impugane and not actually flying, which is completely different, right? So how should one approach this kind of work in order not to fall into those kind of traps?
Yeah. You will remember, Ayanda, that this work, this lexicon, is a follow-up project from the Manual of Conversation that we had put out, which had Zulu grammar and Zulu phrases in it, and then we extracted all the words that were used there and added even more from our own experiences and publications that we've read that are of everyday use. So here in this work, you've got about plus 5,000 entries of both isiZulu and French, and it's back to back. So it gives equivalence. As we say, it's more of a lexicon than an exhaustive dictionary that will give you pronunciation and word classes. Here we have just given equivalence that to make it easy that if you are moving and you have a French document and you want to quickly understand what it means, you can be able to tap into this dictionary and find those words and be able to make up what exactly is being said to you. So it is not a complicated a piece of work. It is quite user-friendly. It brings words as they are. It is mostly on language as it is used today. So we tried by all means to avoid words that are ancient, that are no longer in the public sphere. So we included words that are of everyday use. So you will find words about things that you use at home, words about visiting a restaurant, words about being at the hotel, going out with a friend, dating, as the themes are presented in the Manual of Conversation. So it is a basic work of kickstarting the relationship between the two languages, and it is accessible and user-friendly.
Well, from one Zulu-speaking guy, thanks for expanding our dating pool. Really do appreciate it. And congratulations on the great work you've been able to put together. Mongezi Bolofo, thanks very much again for your time. He is, of course, a linguist.
Thank you very much, my brother.
Thank you. Appreciate your time on the AM Report.